And so I will first invite comments. I'll go Lee, Kathy, Nagruk, and Dimitri.
Okay, great. Oh, yeah, great. I see my slides up. I've had the privilege for the past 30 years, roughly, working in on both the Bering and Chukchi shelves. These are the largest continental shelves the United States has control over, and we share with Russia, as pointed out in the last session. And also, I put this picture up just so you can see that there are a few places in Alaska that you can see Russia. And what I wanted to start with was just, I do ecosystem research, and there's a rich legacy. It's not that well known, but going back to the 1972 environmental agreement between the USSR and USA, signed by President Nixon and Brezhnev in Moscow in 1972, led to a number of research cruises. So even in the Cold War era, we had active multidisciplinary oceanographic cruises that went across the border between the U.S. and the Soviet Union at that time and Russia now. And it's a great challenge, as Kelly Faulkner mentioned in the last panel. We really need, in order to know and understand the ecosystem, to be able to go across this invisible line between the two countries, because all of the nutrients, all of the rich Pacific water that's brought up onto the shelf in the Bering Sea and then flows north through Bering Strait is on the Russian side. And so we have a sort of an incomplete view of the ecosystem. And it's important because there's huge numbers of changes happening in this system. And we know, for example, the sea ice is disappearing, the water temperature is getting warmer. There's a lot more fresh water in the Arctic than there used to be a couple of decades ago. And all of these things have our physical effects, but we don't know what the ecosystem effects are. And so those are, are the fish going to move north? Are animals affected by sea ice disappearing, plankton blooms changing, and so forth? So part of the rich history are these cruises that happened starting in 1976, 1984, 1992. This is the Bear Pack program, and so I've got a couple of the covers of the monographs that came out of this. U.S. and Russian scientists working together in general on Russian ships, but freely crossing the international date line and doing the research that needed to be done. And a successor program to this, and I've got the special issue that came out a couple of years ago, is the Rusalka program that was supported by NOAA. And as Dave Kennedy mentioned, has been suspended for reasons of, I think that maybe the NOAA people can comment, and I'm sure Kathy might have a little bit to say on it. She heroically led that program for more than a decade, putting these cruises together that happened in 2004, 2009, 2013, as well as cruises that help support the mooring replacements in Bering Strait, including on the Russian side. So this is the legacy. We've got a lot of data. We have a lot of understanding. And we're sort of in a rebuilding year, I guess you'd say, now, because these ecosystem studies are no longer going across the U.S.-Russian border. So what are the sort of things that people think are going to happen? I don't have time to go through a lot of science today, so we put up a little cartoon instead. This is what we think. These are shallow seas, so all the production gets to the bottom rather quickly. There's a lot of production associated with sea ice, so as the sea ice melts and all of that material gets to the bottom, if the sea ice disappears, as it is disappearing in this little higher CO2 and higher methane world that we live in now, we think that other organisms are going to come in. So bowhead whales are going to be replaced by other humpbacks and other whales moving north, that killer whales are going to move in, that a lot more material is going to be synthesized in the water column and eaten there. So that's what the scientific hypothesis is. What is a research program that involves lots of countries sailing through Bering Strait? And so I provide this example, the Distributed Biological Observatory, that's supported by a number of agencies through the Interagency Arctic Research Planning Committee that was referred to in the last panel. NSF supports us on a ship that we go up every year on. I'll show you a picture of that in a second. But there are other countries that bought into this, and so we have a total of 6 countries, and the only probably thing that we need to do with this panel is maybe fade out the Russian flag for the time being, because Rusalka was the Russian participation in this ecosystem study of how things are changing in the Pacific Arctic, in that part of the Arctic that's closest to the United States. All of those boxes that are up there on that picture are places where there's high diversity, high production, and so we've been going back every year and looking at them. And so in a few weeks, in July next month, I'll be on the Canadian ship in the lower left-hand corner, the Sir Wilfrid Laurier, which kind of, it goes to the Canadian Arctic every year anyway, so it's sailing through US waters into Canada, where it has a buoy tending mission, does some channel markers, things like this in the Canadian Arctic, and so we've hitched a ride on it every year since 1998. And so we've built up and we stop at the same places every year. And so that's the concept of the Distributed Biological Observatory. We're trying to hit the same places every year, see how the system has changed, and then talk to other countries sending their ships. So the Koreans, the Chinese, the Japanese, Canadians, US, and Russians have been involved in sampling these same locations, briefly doing some basic sampling and seeing how the system has changed. And later in the summer, another example, of course, is the Healy. We'll be on that at the end of the summer, doing some sampling with the support of NOAA along the same set of stations. And the idea has been picked up. The Europeans are starting up a distributed biological observatory in Svalbard, and the Canadians are expanding eastward. As you can see, we just do the first 5 stations that are first 5 group of boxes that are in the United States, and the Canadians have moved into the Canadian Beaufort, and their other BOEM is interested in obviously in the areas in the Beaufort Sea. So what does it come down to? We have some tools that are available to in this rebuilding phase that we're going through, and so I put this example up. We were in Russia a couple of years ago with Kathy's support when she was with NOAA, writing these papers with our Russian colleagues that were put in that special issue of Oceanography that came out in September 2015. This is just so old school. You go into Boris, he must be about 80 and still going to Vietnam and collecting chitons. That's his specialty. So he's a chiton taxonomist. So we're in his office. I said, Jackie, get a picture of that, because it's just, it's a fire trap, but it's sort of amazing to see. We've lost all of that taxonomy, so we really have to tie, and so anyway, the point of this slide is we have a lot of friends, we have a lot of personal relationships we've built up over the decades. That we worked with Boris back as late as, or as early as 1988, and still working with him. And so there are a couple of other tools that are available to us. The International Arctic Science Committee has been mentioned. This is the non-governmental science coordination body that's now has its secretariat in Iceland, that 24 countries are members of. It has an international science initiative in the Russian Arctic, which is really just an action group of experts who get together and talk once a year with Russian participation about what some of the issues are, visas, importing, exporting samples, this sort of thing, the things that come up. So that structure exists. And then there are other organizations. The Pacific Arctic Group has been mentioned, which has been key to bringing the Koreans, the Chinese, and the Japanese into this interest in doing work in the Distributed Biological Observatory and sampling those locations. And finally, just going back to that US-Russian agreement in 1972 is a good basis. It was initially charged ahead by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, led that before NOAA did. And this is my last slide, just to come back to the language that's in the Fairbanks Declaration. This is obviously another tool, as the managers who were up here last panel told us, that they've put a new tool in the tool set to help build U.S.-Russian cooperation in the Arctic. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Lee. And now I invite Kathy to give some remarks.
Okay. I wanted to start out by telling you something of how I actually got started working with Russia in the Arctic. Well, it was first of all, I was a geophysicist studying volcanoes on the seafloor, hydrothermal vents. And I was very much in tune with the funding of National Geographic Society to take great photographs of weird, unusual animals all over the seafloor. And they actually were the responsible party for getting me involved in using Russian equipment, mainly the MIR submersibles, the two of them, and one of their Pisces submersibles in Lake Baikal. And the way it happened was this: I was at Columbia University, and I got a call from one of my camera friends, photographers from Geographic, and he said, "Kathy, I already told all the Russian Academy of Sciences that you're going to find hot water vents in Lake Baikal, so you better say yes." So I said, okay. So the thing was, we wanted to work with Russia in looking at a very unique ecosystem within Russia itself that you could take some marvelous imagery and learn a tremendous amount about evolution in a small little region. So I happily went along with that, and our relationships grew from just the Pisces in Lake Baikal and searching for hot springs there, to actually being involved in using the two Russian MIR submersibles. Now, I have to give National Geographic a tremendous hand for really seeing the benefit, the future of us using our submersibles together. And another one of the fantastic things about Russia was the MIRs come in pairs of two. So if you could actually use one as a camera and the other one as a subject of your film. And we did develop programs before the end of the Soviet Union to use the MIRs. They were also funded by National Science Foundation and the IMAX Foundation, who felt that these tools were really fantastic to be able to use and offered us a lot of help. So that kept our relationship going. We decided to build, actually with the interest of the United States Navy, the Naval Research Lab, the opportunity to carry out and build, first of all, international missions in the Norwegian Greenland Sea and around the Svalbard part of the Arctic Ocean. And this involved collaborations, first time between Russia, Norway, and the United States. And then we added in Germany and I don't know who else. But they were very, very successful, and each party brought to the table something really unique and special that everyone else could use. And in these cases, we were using the MIR submersibles, but we had geophysical equipment from the US, from Germany, from Norway. And we really built a tremendous rapport. And the first expedition then was on a Russian ship, which I actually really like sailing on Russian ships because generally they're very large and they don't move much in the ocean. But so our ambassador from the US to Norway did come to meet us in Spitsbergen, where we signed off on all the diplomatic issues about this. And that grew, those programs grew and grew through time because of our abilities to merge high technology from all the different regions and add increments of funding and all that. At the end of the Cold War, Sherry Goodman mentioned this earlier, it was a very big deal because of the realization that there was probably a lot of contamination in the Arctic Ocean or on the seafloor because of nuclear waste. And I was called by the Naval Research Laboratory to come and help set up their nuclear waste assessment program with Russia, because we had had the experience with Russia. We knew the people, the technicians, the engineers, everything. So that became my next foray for many, many years into our collaboration with getting data back from Russia and sharing data. We actually brought in about 30 Russian scientists to the Naval Research Lab to process their data, which at that time was really important to them because their institutions were just collapsing all around them. And so, of course, we built up a lot of fantastic rapport. I mean, most of these scientists stayed at my house. So it was, that later developed into more marine geology type activities with some of the same people. And I have to give the credit, I think real credit, to the Nunn Lugar, activities that encouraged our United States government to set up collaboration with science communities and engineers. And so we really, in the Navy, I was there at the time, it was really a great honor for me to really move in that direction. At the end of this period of time, it was still continuing as we were trying to map out objects on the seafloor that may contribute to radioactive waste contamination, and we realized we knew nothing much about currents, where are they coming from, going to, what is the interaction with the seafloor, if a reactor had already gone off, but where were the remnants now? And so many cruises were funded to take samples all across the Arctic Ocean, and there's many, many countries. At that point, I definitely had the bug of working together with Russia. I found it so fulfilling to be with people which, prior to those times, everyone thought of as enemies, and not so at all. Through this program, I was then offered a job at NOAA to work with John Calder in the Arctic Research Program. And NOAA's main geographic interest was not actually near Spitsbergen or on the Arctic side Atlantic side of the Arctic, but on the Pacific side of the Arctic, because that's where our fisheries are, and we have neighbors there. So I was asked to try to set up a program with Russian scientists on the Pacific side of the Arctic. And in fact, we made it a point of calling it not the Western Arctic, which the US and Canada call it, but we called it the Pacific Arctic because the Russians refer to that area as the Eastern Arctic, so there's always confusion of what they're talking about. That program we named the Rusalka program, the Russian-American Long-Term Census of the Arctic. And it was really a great effort to expand on the connections that we had made earlier in the studies of contamination in the Arctic, and to really expand out in the world of biology, chemistry, and then put in a series of moorings all the way across the Bering Strait so we could really get some understanding of not just what half of the flow is up to the Arctic, but what the whole flow is, and what's actually flowing with it, the nutrients. The program lasted for somewhat over 10 years, and I really don't like the word terminated, actually, there. I think it's dormant. It would be a nicer word for us to put there. We have had, in the last few years since, for combinations of reasons, sanctions and other issues, some difficulties in getting ships. But I will say one thing which I thought was very innovative and very much involved our two governments was that I ended up leading this program with my partner, Alexei Ostrovsky, who was science counselor at the US Embassy here. And we were both geophysicists and had known each other for our work, and we decided, well, we're both now in the government, we might as well do something worthwhile, so let's start this program. And we realized we probably weren't going to get anywhere very fast unless we incorporated all the different factions of people who might want to fight against the program. So we decided to bring everyone in so we would all be on the same team. And that's included having the Russian Navy being actually the head of the Rusalka program. And we were sponsored by the Admiral Alexeyev from Gningi, and a fantastic gentleman who has since died, unfortunately. And really, I think that relationship with the Russian Navy on board with us, every expedition, gave everyone a goal towards moving forward. And I've exceeded greatly my 5-minute limit. Mm-hmm. And so, but doesn't come close to a decade.
You've got 10 seconds.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Kathy. I know there's a rich history there and a lot to go through in such a short amount of time, but I appreciate very much not only what you presented today, but your long engagement and positive engagement, so thank you. Next, we have Nuke, who will speak on behalf of UIC Science. Thank you very much, Duke.
First of all, thank you, John. Thank you, Mike, for allowing me to speak here. It's a very humbling experience, and I appreciate it very much. So I'm as you mentioned, Nagaru Karcharik. I'm the general manager for UIC Science, and we provide and have been continuing the long tradition of incorporating and enhancing Western science with traditional knowledge in Barrow through by providing the logistics. The research, we also manage the Barrow Arctic Research Center and the Barrow Environmental Observatory, and it's very unique. We have the research center and the observatory's location is very unique in the sense that there's a community right next door, and there. We have a long history of supporting research. It goes back to the first International Polar Year, all the way through the first days of the Naval Arctic Research Laboratory, where some of the first jobs for the people of Utqiagvik were at the research center. And there's lots of stories of them bringing in small mammals and trading them in for quarters and nickels and taking that to the store, and that was their money for the day. So we were helping them out then, and at all the ice camps. Our people are very familiar with sea ice, and they were utilized for their expertise out at the ice camps that were stationed outside of Barrow. And we continue that tradition to this day, and one of the challenges that we face, even with the building of the new bark facility that we currently reside in right now, is we're still utilizing some of the same facilities that they utilized in the early days of NARL, back in the 40s, 50s, and 60s. So UIC, our corporate management, has identified it as a priority to build up our infrastructure, our science research support infrastructure, so that we can continue to support the very best research in the world and continue to be the flagship station for the Arctic research for the United States. And we're hoping to continue that tradition.
Great, thank you very much. I greatly appreciate that and the good work that UIC does. And I think, as you were telling me before we got together, there's even some examples of where UIC Science has assisted Russian adventurers. Could you tell us just a little bit about that?
Yeah, so it's kind of an interesting story. So there was I don't remember the gentleman's name, but they were doing a expedition from Russia across the North Pole to Canada, and then they were following the coast and then all the way up to Barrow, and then from Barrow all the way back to Russia. But the whole point of it was to stay out on the sea ice. And it took them a number of years just to get to Barrow. When they got to Barrow one year, the sea ice conditions were to the point where they could not continue on. So they decided to, they worked with us to store their vehicles, all of their equipment, everything for the year. So we pulled everything out of Connex vans, we put everything in there, and they went home. And the next year, the following year, they came back, and despite some issues with customs, we assisted them in getting all of their stuff ready and providing everything that we could. They had very unique equipment that you couldn't go down to Napa Auto Parts to get parts for. So we did what we could, scrounged up everything that we could. They actually even bought, and we supplied them with some local traditional foods, and we got them on their way. And actually they have a website where we have a picture with them as well. So that was an example of a very successful collaboration with them. And we were happy to see them, and they were happy that we were there to help them out as well. So.
Yes, thank you, Nuke. You continue in a long line of history of support from the region, not only to support the science, but also to participate in the science. And I'm so glad to see you, on behalf of UIC Science, continuing that tradition and continuing to work with us. I see you actively engaged with the Arctic Icebreaker Coordinating Committee and with other efforts accordingly. And with international partners, as you've said. You talked about Chinese scientists coming in to get support and others. So keep up the good work, and thank you for that.
Thank you.
Last we have Dimitri, and just a note before he begins, Dimitri was born in Russia and he continues to do research in Russia. Unfortunately, we were not able with such short notice to have a Russian-based Russian scientist with us today, but it does give me a chance to give you a teaser for an upcoming meeting that the Arctic Research Commission and the National Ice Center are part of about a little less than a month from today in Washington, about a half mile from here at the Naval Heritage Center. We will be having a 3-day symposium. We do this every 2 years. This will be the 7th year, so this stretches back 14 years now. This symposium is titled The Impacts of an Ice-Diminished Arctic on Naval and Maritime Operations. And thanks to the WWF, who has helped with logistics, we were able to bring 3 Russian scientists over to participate in this symposium, and we're very pleased about that. There's more information at arctic.gov, and I encourage all of you to come. Registration is free. But back to this session, Dimitri, who is at George Washington University, will give us a few words about his experiences as a practitioner of Arctic research.
Thank you, John. It's very nice to be here. It's really a pleasure that we have this Polar Initiative in Wilson Center. I just want to mention that when I came to Washington in 2010, I always thought, I've always dreamed to be in the Arctic group, and I made Arctic group on my card, my business card. There was no group, but now we have a big group, and no one even surprises when we talk about Arctic, and they see we're from Washington, D.C. So just to give few examples of continued collaboration, and I really don't see, much point of, confirming that Russia and United States are partners in the Arctic. There are many ongoing projects, research projects on both sides involving American and Russian scientists, both bilaterally and internationally. But I just want to give you a few examples. It's interesting that I just thought it all started in '99. It was a horrible year, it was financial crisis in Russia. And me and my friend were trying to get to Turkey on a car which was 20 years old, and he just bought it. We didn't make it past his driveway, so there was no alternative. All tickets were sold, everything was expensive, so someone said, well, you can go to the Arctic on an expedition. So that's how I ended up in Yamal Peninsula, near Bovanyankova. It was kind of interesting trip because it required 5 hours on a helicopter to get there from Vorkuta. Logistics was horrible. Helicopter couldn't pick us up for 7 days, I think, 5 or 7 days. And it's interesting that now you can get there by train, right? So Arctic is a very interesting region. It changes very fast, both environmentally, but also there are huge transformations, both social and political, economical transformations that occurred over this short period of time. So to study those transformations with the scientists, both physical and social scientists, we need data. Unfortunately, Arctic is that region where this data is very sparse. If we want to have some understanding of any process, if we want to have some projections and recommendations for policymakers, we have to rely on data. There is no data, and I think this is still a big problem, and I'm really glad that there is a push on all levels to sort of connect various countries, and including Russia and the United States. But just to give a few examples, we have very close collaborations with several institutions. I, by background, is a cryolithologist and glaciologist. I'm interested in ice, mostly ground ice. And as a climatologist, I'm interested in how this changing climate and human activities influence ecosystems, both natural ecosystems and those ecosystems that are being modified by human presence. To understand it, you have to be really international, and of course, you saw that map many times. Russia is the largest Arctic territory. You cannot solve any scientific questions if you do not consider participants from Russia. We have several, probably 6 or 7, federally funded projects right now at GW that target various aspects of Arctic, starting from hydrology and permafrost, all the way to human migration, indigenous populations, and Arctic urban sustainability. Those are federally funded projects. They all have very substantial Russian component. The question becomes, how do we formalize those relationships? Because it is not easy, both financially or logistically to formalize those. And it's getting better. I think we have positive experience over the last 10, 15 years, but certainly we have challenges. For example, recently we have a lot of Russian partners who don't want to receive any funds from United States for their work because they're afraid to be labeled as, foreign agents and things like that. But the research collaborations continues. I think for Russians it's very beneficial to have bilateral collaboration with the United States because it really allows publications in better journals. English language is always a problem in Russia. So this is one thing. It allows Russians to use better sometimes or just more expensive equipment. And obviously there are some problems with moving this equipment. Hopefully this agreement will help it. And for American scientists, it's pretty obvious that without involvement of Russian partners, our understanding of Arctic as a system, whether it's natural system, whether it's human system, is impossible.
Thank you very much, Dima. I appreciate that. And I also encourage you during the reception to see if you can identify Andrey Petrov, who is in the audience with us today, another Russian by birth who is now at Iowa, and he can also tell you about this. We have time for, I think, 2 questions tops, if anyone has any. Thank you, Andrey.
Yeah, I can identify myself. So I'm Andrey Petrov, and I'm upcoming president of the International Arctic Social Sciences Association. So I thought it will be voice of a social scientist. So I have small comments saying for our association, IASA, 25% of membership is Russian. So that's an important number that we need to appreciate, and we need to make sure that there is multilateral, bilateral relations with the science. And of course, in the United States, we have a wonderful NSF Arctic Social Sciences program that does invest in circumpolar research, like Dima suggested, right? And that should continue. My question, I guess, would be if you could reflect on how you work, how your collaborative work was transformational in respect to, say, local communities. How does it help those residents, whether on the Russian side, on the US side, with whom you had a chance to work, if you had a chance to work with people? I know some of you did. So how the fact that it's a collaborative work helps locals and local community address their needs?
Thank you for the question. Anyone? Kathy?
Try to keep this short. And from my perspective, actually, much of my time in the government was working on working groups with the Arctic Council. And I was the US lead for a marine biodiversity program for the Arctic and out of the conservation of Arctic flora and fauna. And in that wide array, it included a lot of permanent participants from the local communities all around. And so we did try to hire, actually, or gather information that all of these local communities had gathered about the status of their biodiversity change, or just doing baseline studies all around the Arctic. And so I think in that way we had a very positive input from the local residents as well as the other biologists, which I was able to get several of them from our Rusalka program to be the Russian representatives, so we could do that. So that's one way that through the Arctic Council we were able to do that.
Thank you.
I could tell you from a community standpoint, and providing logistics, the science that comes into our community provides very meaningful and year-round work. I have a staff of 15 in Barrow, 15 people in Barrow, and more so in the summertime that work full-time for me, from doing things like bear guarding and such for people out on the sea ice, to just general labor and construction on the environmental observatory. So community science and community interaction, I think, is very important. I hope the model that we have in Barrow of supporting science at a local level and indigenous level can be a model to use in other places of the world internationally as well. So.
Great, thank you very much. I think I'll take a prerogative of the moderator here just to wrap up with a closing statement. And I read something interesting by Paul Krugman, who writes opinion pieces for the New York Times. And I think what we've done with these two panels is I hope, begun to prove him incorrect on something. And he said, we live in a post-Enlightenment age in which rationality, science, evidence, logical argument, and debate have lost the battle in many sectors, perhaps even in society generally, to superstition, faith, opinion, and orthodoxy. And I think what you've heard in these last two panels are efforts to push back against that. And I hope you'll agree with me that great progress is being made in that regard in the Arctic and in our scientific cooperation between the U.S. and Russia. So again, panelists, thank you very much. Mike, back to you.
Okay.
Thank you, John, and thank you to all the panelists for that two panels on science and research. We appreciate it very much, and I think, in fact, you did disprove it very much. Now it's an honor to introduce the next keynote speaker, our fourth of the day. So coming onto the stage now is Admiral Paul Zhukov. He assumed the duties of the 25th Commandant of the U.S. Coast Guard on May 30th of 2014. He leads the oldest continuous seagoing service and the largest component of the Department of Defense. Joining him for this keynote discussion is David Martin. David has been with CBS News National Security. He is a national security correspondent since 1993, covering the Pentagon and the State Department, and in that capacity, he's reported on virtually every major defense, intelligence, and international affairs initiative, effort, and issue around the globe. Please welcome David Martin and Admiral Zhukov.
Thank you. I've got to tell CBS to update my bio. I've been working there since 1983, not 93, but which just makes me older than I want to admit. As the national security correspondent for CBS, I have to begin by admitting that I don't follow day-to-day developments in the Arctic simply because it's one of the few regions in the world that is currently free of conflict. And there's enough conflict elsewhere to keep me busy. It occurs to me that the Arctic is somewhat like space was in the 1950s. Everybody realizes its potential significance, but there hasn't yet been, for the public at least, a galvanizing event like Sputnik to sort of concentrate the collective talents of the United States on a new realm such as the Arctic. So will there be a Sputnik-like event in the Arctic, or is change in the Arctic evolutionary enough so that we're not going to miss out on what's going to happen up there, whatever it turns out to be? We've obviously got just the right person to ask those questions of, but since I spend all my days in the Pentagon, I want to ask my first questions from a military perspective. The Navy is due to come out fairly shortly with an update of its Arctic roadmap. The last one was published in 2014. And it read, the region is expected to remain a low-threat security environment where nations resolve differences peacefully. Now, obviously, a lot has happened since 2014, particularly in U.S.-Russian relations. So I'd like to begin by asking you, Admiral, does the Arctic remain a low-threat environment where differences will be settled peacefully?
Yeah, that's a great question, David. And so when you ask those questions, it really goes into the planning paradigm of what we would call assumptions. And if you look at where the Navy is being pulled in the national military strategy today around the world, it's at some point in time you have to manage risk. And what is the lowest threshold of risk? And I would say right now for the Navy, there are two places where the Navy can afford to go at risk. One is in the Arctic, and the other is in the Western Hemisphere. I met with President Varela from Panama yesterday. And in fact, next week I'll be meeting with the leaders of Colombia, Ecuador, and Panama again. And they're saying we need more United States Coast Guard off our coast because people are dying in our countries from violent crime, because of drug flows leaving South America, destined for the United States. So it's primarily a Coast Guard mission. So you've got the same paradigm as we look at the Arctic. The assumption is today it's benign. But if you spend any time up there, and I want to recognize former President of Iceland, I was at an Arctic summit, and I met this debonair gentleman with no security detail, and I introduced myself, and he's the President of Iceland. He then addressed, this was hosted in Anchorage, Alaska, and I think the year was about 2012, 2013, and basically admonished the United States for losing strategic focus on what is happening in the Arctic. And so if you're living here, the word polar acceleration probably doesn't resonate with you. It was only in 1979 when NASA put satellites in outer space that really started looking at sea ice retreat. And so that data point is very limited in nature, and we can certainly measure the rise in ocean temperature, and what is filling that vacuum right now is human activity. So what is that activity going to look like in 20 years? The change, I would say, if you use evolutionary and Sputnik in the same sentence, a Sputnik is a black swan event. What if it's the cruise ship's Crystal Serenity? It runs aground on an uncharted object, and you have the equivalent of the Titanic sinking. That was in 1912. To this day, the Coast Guard continues to fly the International Ice Patrol after that horrific loss of life of a cruise ship. So we have more of that activity filling the vacuum. Rich oil and gas reserves are up there. Today, oil trades at $42 a barrel. So if you look at oil and gas, about 33% of the world's gas, about 13% of the world's oil is up in the Arctic. Maybe it's locked in right now, but is it going to be that way for perpetuity, or does oil reach a price point where it's now profitable to harvest again? And for the United States, we have explored the extent of our outer continental shelf. It's the size of the state of Texas. And about half of all of those oil and gas reserves are really within our sovereign rights to exploit. But we have not ratified the Law of the Sea Convention. I think we really need to start there and abide by rules of behavior by ratifying the Law of the Sea Convention, state what is rightfully ours, and recognizing there are significant competing claims in the Arctic, to include Russia claiming all the way up to the North Pole. So how is that going to look like in 10 or 15 years today? So you've got an assumption that it's a low threat, but when you have a Sputnik event and you can't evolve quick enough, and then you find yourself on the strategic sidelines as we've abdicated a region where there may be contesting challenges in this domain.
So we've got about 15 minutes, and I want to take as many questions as possible from the audience. So while everybody's lining up behind the mics, let me just follow up with that. What is the Coast Guard's current capability to do search and rescue in the Arctic?
Yeah. So I'll take you back 40 years. And 40 years ago, you would have seen Ensign Zukunft sitting here. At that point in time, we had 7 icebreakers in our national fleet. Today, we have 2. And one of those was a brand new ship 40 years ago, and now it's a 40-year-old ship. It's as old as I am. Actually, it's older. I got a head start. And then we have a medium icebreaker. So this is an area where we have not paid attention to in terms of where do we invest as an Arctic nation to be able to be a strategic player in this domain. And quite frankly, David, we have not made those investments, and the time is long overdue.
So where did the U.S. sort of lose lock on the Arctic? If they had those icebreakers 40 years ago, but now we're down to just this one old 40-year-old one and a mothballed one.
It really begins with, what was our strategic framework for the Arctic? And it wasn't until several years ago where we actually codified a strategic framework for the Arctic region. We had already written a strategy for the Coast Guard, but if you live in this town, you can write strategies. They're like dead cats. You can swing them around and they don't hit anything. It better connect to something. So in this case, we want to make sure that we connect to national policy in the Arctic. So the epiphany was really, we have an awakening at the national level that we have got to pay attention to what's happening in the Arctic. And it's not just about scientific support. It is a domain that has opened up. And what is our strategic approach? Is it going to be the next military campaign? Or is it going to be working among Coast Guards, looking at rising sea levels, northern migrations of fish stocks, where we have today 3 billion people subsist on protein as their source of fish. China has a distant water fleet of 20,000 ships, will go anywhere in the world to harvest fish. Now, we have a moratorium not to fish up there. That's a great piece of paper, but that's all that it is. So if we've got paper policy with nothing to back it up, we are long overdue to put our best foot forward and actually have the means to implement some of these policies.
Okay. Do we have somebody at the mic there?
Admiral, my name is Peter Humphrey. I'm an intel analyst and a former diplomat. I'm wondering if things are progressing in such a way that we will reinvigorate hydrophone arrays in Arctic waters and maybe even look toward a port that can handle submarine operations in those waters. Or are those just pie in the sky wastes of money? What's your opinion on those investments?
That'd probably be a good question for the CNO to answer, especially with our submarine fleet. And by the way, I did call him Saturday as soon as I heard about the USS Fitzgerald tragedy. When I called him, he was packing his bags to be out there to grieve with those families. But another point, if you want to talk about, remotely operated vehicles, about 5% of the Arctic, and maybe it's slightly less, is chartered to what we would call 21st century standards. And I approached Google with this challenge of how do we map and survey the entire Arctic region as sea ice retreats, because many of these waters have not been surveyed. And if they have, you're dating back to the era of Captain Cook. You've got seismic activity, the seabed shifts, and so there's a lot of unknown out there. So first I would look at, what is the survey data? And this is to our colleagues from Iceland. I was on the on the Icelandic Coast Guard vessel Thor. Thor, that's a great name, by the way. It's a sea god. But first of all, the captain of the ship has got over 58 years of sea duty serving in the Arctic. He's an old salt. But I looked at the datum on his charts, and they were dated 1912, when Ernest Shackleton was hanging out in the Endurance. And so it really underscores the fact that we don't know what we don't know in terms of survey data. And so if I were to place a priority, the first is the mapping, the survey work that needs to happen up in the Arctic. I would conjecture that our submarine fleet, they pass one track line to the next. We didn't hit anything. This is a safe route, but you have more and more activity going up there. And so that would be the first place I would look at. And then obviously, a deep water port is lacking. So if this becomes the next Suez Canal, the shortcut to Europe between Asia, what is lacking is a deep water port that can do intermodal work, especially within the containerized fleet. And so we're working with the Army Corps of Engineers. In fact, we're required to look at potentials for deep water ports up in Alaska. There are two in particular that may be appealing to the commercial and military fleets, Port Clarence and also in Nome, Alaska. But we're doing a study with the Army Corps of Engineers on that right now, mostly on the commercial, on the Coast Guard side, but not so much on the submarine front.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So I can give you the Navy's answer to your question because I have it here from their roadmap for the Arctic from 2014. They said there will be low demand for additional naval involvement in the Arctic. Therefore, current naval capabilities are sufficient to meet near-term operational needs. Doesn't sound like they're looking to open a subbase in the Arctic. Do we have another question there?
I have a question
I'm
over
sorry.
here. Yeah, Augustus Salzona, a strong, loyal supporter of the President of the United States. The question is this, in light of renewed interests and, I guess, priority in terms of the international war on drugs or war on drugs here in the U.S., and in light of the probability that as the Coast Guard and our other forces start cutting off the lines of supply of drugs into this country, is there a possibility or a reasonable possibility that the drug industry will be able to find other routes, such as going north or coming through the north?
Yeah, great question. We had a high-level meeting in Miami just a week ago, from Thursday, talking about some of the very challenges. So it's all, I would view this as counterinsurgency. In this case, the insurgency, it's not an ideology. It's all about greed and money. And where do you get the best return on investment? So here's the business plan. If you are a coca farmer in Colombia, you can produce a kilo of cocaine, and I won't even get into the opioid because that's even more concerning, for $2,000. You can sell that in New York for $20,000. You can sell it in Europe for $80,000. You can sell it in Europe for $200,000. I don't know what the market is up in Alaska, but I'm not sure how many people have that kind of disposable income, that can pay, $50,000, $60,000, $70,000 for a kilo. Or do you go the other way and say for $10 you can get a hit of heroin and then laced with fentanyl? So the real problem for the United States is we try to get in front of the flow, is what are we doing behind to deal with the demand signal we've got in the United States? And that, to me, is the number one problem. I met with the president of Honduras last week, and I said, we're caught in a crossroad. I'm right next to the number one producer of drugs, and on the other side is the number one consumer of drugs, and that is the United States of America. And so when we look at violent crime and why people send their children with human smugglers to take refuge in the United States, we bear a burden of responsibility for all of that is happening because it is our consumption that really is what is driving this train right now. So is the potential there? If there's a dollar to be had, absolutely. I've been out to Little Diomede several years ago, and I saw residents out there that were laced out on methamphetamine. There are no meth labs out there, so there's a means to an end, and it really is about this profit incentive of people will sell their souls to apply their trade.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Go ahead.
Thank you, Admiral. Steve Keating from Georgetown University Institute for the Study of Diplomacy. First, a comment and one question. The comment is the great value the Coast Guard does. You talked about the Sputnik event. There's so much that people do not see what the Coast Guard does in terms of preventing hazards at sea. So great kudos to the Coast Guard for having such a systematic and an intelligent-based safety of life at sea program through your publications like Proceedings, et cetera. So here's my question. You mentioned the need for surveys. You mentioned the large area the Coast Guard has to patrol. Is there any thought of perhaps partnering with the indigenous peoples of Alaska to kind of leverage an Alaskan auxiliary for search and rescue and or disaster prevention in the American Arctic?
Yeah, well, that's a great question, and we're really at the threshold of that. So right now we're in the process of standing up a squadron of H-60 helicopters in Kotzebue. We were doing that out of Barrow, Alaska several years ago when Shell had over 22 ships, several thousand oil workers going back and forth. And it would be perceived as a little bit disingenuous on the part of the Coast Guard of we're only there to save oil workers and big oil. Meanwhile, we've got these umiaks are having to go further and further offshore as sea ice retreats to get their quota of mammals for subsistence living. So we're already out there already. We have a strong outreach with the indigenous communities. We made the mistake of everyone should wear a life jacket. We gave them bright orange life vests. Well, if you want to repel what you're trying to eat, put on an orange life vest. We gave them white ones. And simple messages, reaching out to the schools as well, that kids don't float. And obviously, I mean, this is very frigid temperature. But we're trying to move a culture along. In fact, even when they looked at more humane ways of taking a whale. In fact, a whale gives itself to the community. Initially, airlines wouldn't carry the explosive projectile to distribute to the community. So we said, hey, we'll put it in our C-130s. But we have an aggressive outreach program with the program. So let me I'll share you this story. In August, I went up to Greenland, and I went up there with Senator Angus King and two world-renowned climatologists, and we went out to the Jakobshavn Glacier. But we met with the Inuit tribe there and the elders, and they said the glacier hadn't moved in the last millennium, but in 5 years, Jakobshavn has retreated over 25 miles. In fact, on our flight out there, it looked like the unbridled Colorado River in the United States, except instead of flowing into the ocean, it goes down a deep hole called a Moulin. Disco Bay, that would be frozen year-round, is now open year-round, and what they would use as a conveyance with sled teams requires a boat. So when you ask them what is happening in their world, the world is changing very fast. So much as sea ice retreats, Earth is exposed, rare metals exist, and China has taken a very keen interest in those rare metals. So a lot of this is happening, not evolutionary in Darwinian terms, but it is happening almost in Sputnik terms.
So we're almost out of time, but let's take one more question here.
Okay. My name is Jessica Shadian, CIC and Bill Graham Center from University of Toronto. My question comes back to this flying dead cat scenario I can't seem to get out of my head. But it's kind of going back to like how do you get kind of the financial ear of the White House aside from perhaps the Serenity sinking. And I'm wondering if there's anything, if maybe you can comment perhaps on the idea of strengthening collaboration with Canadian Coast Guard and also your thoughts on the Arctic Coast Guard Forum and how that might serve as elevating the role of the Coast Guard in the Arctic.
Yeah, I would just categorize that our relationship with my dear friend Jeff Hutchinson, who's just taken over as commissioner after Jody Thomas, we have had a long-standing relationship with our Canadian partners. In fact, when we're doing survey work up in the Arctic with the Louis and with the Coast Guard Carter Healy, we do exchange of information, exchange of shipwriters, full transparency of some of the survey data taking place. We're looking at the Diefenbacher design. Is that something that we can bring in-house and then modify into a heavy icebreaker within the United States Coast Guard? On the Great Lakes, we have an agreement there. If one of our icebreakers breaks down, Canada will help break out our ports, and vice versa. If one of theirs, we will help them as well. So complete synergy with Canada as we look at all things Arctic. I would say the biggest challenge we have right now, and I'll go back 7 years ago. I was the on-scene commander for the Deepwater Horizon oil spill. And with all of the science that we have in the Gulf of Mexico, we didn't have enough information to know whether it was prudent to use more dispersants to prevent oil from coming into the wetlands and what the effect would be throughout the food chain in the Gulf of Mexico. I would say we were light years ahead of what we knew about Bethnics and science in the Gulf of Mexico, and we're still just scratching the surface up in the high latitudes. The sharing of information, scientific information, that really doesn't have the sovereignty stamp on it. It was in everybody's collective interest. So I would just continue to advocate, and I know the Arctic Council is advocating for that as well. And I'll just close by saying, the Arctic Council is really more policy, focused, but then how do you implement policy? And that is really through the Arctic Coast Guard Forum. And so when Canada handed off the chair to the United States, we saw that as an opportunity to really move out and create this Arctic Coast Guard Forum. And can we fill this vacuum of the Arctic, first and foremost, with Coast Guards of the Arctic nations, and not make this the next, Battle of Midway scenario? And that's really the direction that we're trying to move in right now, but really in lockstep with Canada. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Admiral. I think that is the end of our Q&A session here, and we're going to go to a panel now. Is that right? Okay.
Yes, please thank the Admiral, who'll join us on the panel as well, and to David Martin, who has been with CBS News since 1983. Thank you, and I would ask David, thank you. And I'd ask the next set of panelists to please come up. So our next panel, I will be the moderator, so I will move over to the podium. But let me just, I'll just introduce from the chair. We'll just make everything so much easier. Well, I thought that was a perfect jumping off point for this discussion on Coast Guard cooperation needs and challenges. You've already met Admiral Zhukov. Senator Sullivan is running behind and may not make it, but to my left is Asgrimir Asgrims, a guy with a last name of Sfrega. I will say it again and again, should not have a problem with the last name. Asgrimson. Close?
Perfect.
Perfect. Is Chief of Operations for the Iceland and the Coast Guard, and Paul Berkman is Professor of Practice in Science and Diplomacy at the Fletcher School. Paul, I had absolutely no problem with your name at all.
Thank you, Mike.
Excellent. I would ask Paul perhaps for you to start with a few comments, and then we'll work our way down the table. Thank you.
Okay. First, I'd like to thank the Wilson Center for convening this discussion on the U.S. and the Arctic, and also congratulate the Arctic Circle for continued progress, including reports that I understand are coming out from Meade and team. So this session is on security, and one of the features that emerged with the Arctic Council itself is the concept that it will not deal with military security issues. And so a discussion relating to security is moving in directions that have been complicated for the past. I'd like to take a journey, in a sense, thinking about the Arctic in a global context. My introduction to the Arctic was really in 2010 when I convened with Russian colleagues the first formal dialogue between NATO and Russia. This was a NATO Advanced Research Workshop on Environmental Security in the Arctic Ocean. It went through the full NATO-Russia Council, so 27 members of NATO plus Russia approved this specific workshop. And the idea was that security really wasn't being discussed in the Arctic, and that environmental security perhaps was a pathway to begin thinking about security in the Arctic, recognizing that any discussions about the Arctic are incomplete without Russia. And so we began this dialogue, convened at the University of Cambridge in 2010. We had 17 countries involved at the level of ambassador. We had 4 ministries from Russia. Artur Chelingarov, who was mentioned several times, was represented. And out of that came a series of activities, brought me to Russia 4 times in meetings with Vladimir Putin. First one in 2010 at the International Arctic Forum. And so from those discussions came sets of perspectives on security. And it doesn't really matter whether it's military security or climate security or food security or energy security or cyber security. If you peel back the envelope, all flavors of security really deal with risks of political, economic, and cultural instability. And these risks are both urgent and immediate. And this is the lens at which governments have historically operated. They've operated through a security lens. It's interesting that we have this meeting in the Reagan building with President Reagan and President Gorbachev meeting in 1986. And in that time frame, President Gorbachev identified in 1987 in Murmansk in a famous speech the notion of burning security issues. In the same speech, he made the suggestion that there should be an Arctic Research Council. And this focus on research has taken hold. There was an envoy from President Gorbachev went to the State Department at that time frame and asked whether such a council would make sense, building on lessons from Antarctica, where during the height of the Cold War, the United States and the Soviet Union were able to set aside nearly 10% of the Earth for peaceful purposes only, using science as a framework for cooperation. And out of that discussion, we now have an Arctic Council. And the Arctic Council began in 1996 and was really at the level of mid-level diplomats between 1996 and 2009. In 2009, the level of discussion moved to the level of foreign ministers, and it was in 2009 that the first mention of the word peace emerged in the Arctic Council declarations. Peace is now included in every subsequent declaration from the Arctic Council. In terms of thinking about the Arctic, and just to put things in context, because we do live in a complicated moment, I think, it was the 20th century when we had the First World War and the Second World War. These were not regional wars, they weren't continental wars, they were world wars. And the notion of a world war undeniably represents our interconnectedness as a global civilization. It wasn't pockets of people, it was global, it was world. And if we think about it in context, the 20th century is one century. The oldest calendars on Earth are about 6,000 years old. That's about 60 centuries. And if you take 1 century out of 60, it's like 1 year out of a lifespan of 60. It's an infancy. And so putting things in perspective, in effect, we're just in our infancy as a globally interconnected civilization, understanding how to manage issues and impacts and resources that cross or extend beyond the boundaries of nations. And the Arctic, like the Antarctic and outer space, have been regions of cooperation independent of other activities around the world. And the reason for that cooperation has been science as a tool of diplomacy. So I would like to end, I suppose, on a note of hope and optimism that because the Arctic has science as a tool of diplomacy, as certainly symbolized and through the recent agreement on enhancing international Arctic science cooperation. It wasn't beginning, it was enhancing. The Arctic has the opportunity to continue to mature as a region of peace and stability. And I would also note that in listening to Vladimir Putin 4 times, in each of the speeches he said the same thing, that for Russia, the Arctic is its economic future. And so in the same sense, it would be counterproductive for Russia, as well as all of the Arctic states, to destabilize the Arctic. So I see hope on the horizon for the Arctic continuing to be a zone of peace and cooperation and a symbol of hope for the rest of the world.
Thank you, Paul, for those opening comments. I'm next going to go to Chief Asgrimson, but I would like to welcome to the podium Honorable Senator Dan Sullivan from the state of Alaska. Thank you, Senator, for coming.
Yeah, good to be here.
Chief?
Okay, I guess I need the little doohickey there.
Paul, can you pass down the remote? Thank you.
Okay, to put my presentation into a little perspective, I would like to talk about a few facts about Iceland with relation to the Arctic and search and rescue. And first point is Iceland is an island just south of the Arctic Circle. It's in the middle of the North Atlantic. Despite the name, navigation is not interrupted by ice most of the time. It's about 50 years since we last had any major problem with ice causing trouble to navigation. The island, the northern part, is about 2,600 kilometers from the North Pole, 4,500 kilometers from here. And it's the 18th largest island in the world. And we have 4,800 kilometers of coastline, or 3,000 miles. But our search and rescue region, the region we are internationally responsible for search and rescue, is almost 2 million square kilometers. That's almost 20 times the size of the island itself. And our search and rescue region extends quite far into the Arctic. Population of Iceland, 350,000. No military forces. We have Coast Guard. We have police. Coast Guard, we are responsible for search and rescue on sea and for aircraft. And the police for anything on land. And we are supported by volunteers, both search and rescue volunteers that both do operation on land and at sea. The tasks of the Icelandic Coast Guard, there are 8 main categories. I'm not going to go into each one of them, but some of them are common with the other Coast Guards around us, but other ones are not. I would like to mention hydrographic surveying and nautical charting, because the Admiral mentioned that earlier. This is what we are trying to do around our island, to make the charts more or newer and more reliable. But the topic here is search and rescue, and that's what we are responsible for. Ambulance and medical evacuation service in the sea around Iceland, and we assist also inland, as we have the only such helicopters in Iceland, and civil protection. And for example, a big cruise liner on fire or sinking north of Iceland in our search and rescue region is something we would classify as a civil protection case. And the assets we have to do our task is we have 3 offshore patrol vessels, number of coastal patrol vessels. We have 1 maritime surveillance aircraft. We have 3 long-range search and rescue helicopters, and our staff is between 200 and 250 people. But we are augmented, as I mentioned before, by volunteers which have a number of nearshore rescue boats. But if you think we are few and we have a few assets, I think we could say we all share the same thing in the Arctic, all the Coast Guards. I forgot to... Okay. We all have long coastlines. Just Alaska itself has, I just checked that on Google, has 54,600 kilometers. Remember, Iceland has 4,800, so just in Alaska, the Admiral has a great task, or big task. There are large land masses for helicopters to fly from one air station to another. Usually it's over a large area of land. Extensive search and rescue regions, and of course, as you all know, extreme weather and sea conditions, ice, and there are few assets. Lack of infrastructure, and but at the same time, we have increased human activity. So, in order to do something about this, we have, among us, formed the Arctic Coast Guard Forum. If I recall right, it was the Russians in a meeting, the North Atlantic Coast Guard Forum meeting in UK in 2013, I believe, that initiated the talks, the representatives of the Federal Border Guard. And the next few years, the preparations were made by the Canadian Coast Guard, but the Arctic Coast Guard Forum was established under U.S. Coast Guard leadership in October 2015, and the whole time supported by the 5 other Nordic, or the 5 Nordic countries that are in the Arctic Council. These are Coast Guard and Border Guard organizations. Some are legally responsible for search and rescue, or maritime search and rescue, while others have the duties to execute search and rescue operations. And we are establishing line of communications. It's the bosses that meet and talk. We support and back up each other. We share best practices. We plan to exchange personnel, have common training, and the first live exercise under the Arctic Coast Guard Forum will be held in September this year between the ocean between Iceland and Greenland. Thank you.
Thank you. Senator, thank you for being here. We're going down the row here, and I would like for you to at least to provide some opening comments about your thoughts about safety, security in the Arctic.
Well, it's great to be here. Thanks, Mike, and I want to thank everybody for being here. Sorry, I was running a little bit late. I first want to begin by thanking the Alaskans. I know there's a bunch of constituents here. I'm having a little bit of a hard time seeing, but I see the faint elder statesman look of Meade Treadwell, I believe, in the audience, and Alice Rogoff, and many others. So Christina Woolston, I know, is here somewhere. So great to see, and a Marine buddy of mine who's running state ops for Craig Fleener. So great to see so many Alaskans here. And I actually want to begin, we're talking about the Coast Guard, and I'm not just doing it because Admiral Z's up here on the panel with me, but I can't say enough about you know, the Coast Guard in the United States. And you see it literally every single day. I had the honor to go out to a commissioning of the National Security Cutter Monroe with the Commandant and General Secretary Kelly, and it was just a really special event for me. I was in Kodiak 2 weeks ago, which is America's largest Coast Guard base, and the men and women out there do a great job. And just this morning, Admiral Pekoski was testifying for his confirmation hearing, Coast Guard retired Vice Admiral who is now going to be, I think very soon, the head of TSA. So literally you see the excellence, I see it, I think most Americans see the excellence of the Coast Guard, our Coast Guard everywhere, and in particular you see it in Alaska. So Admiral, thank you for that. I just wanted to kind of give a little bit of my perspective, particularly as a senator who sits on the Armed Services Committee and the Commerce Committee. And the Commerce Committee, I chair the subcommittee that oversees the Coast Guard and fisheries, and then on the Armed Services Committee, we've been talking a lot about the Arctic of late. As a matter of fact, during General Mattis's, Secretary Mattis's confirmation hearing, I asked him a number of questions about what was going on in the Arctic, what he thought. This is his quote from the new Secretary of Defense: "The Arctic is a key strategic terrain. Russia is taking aggressive steps to increase its presence there. I will prioritize the development of an integrated strategy for the Arctic. I believe that our interests in the security of the Arctic would benefit from increasing the focus of the Department of Defense on this region." So when you look at the Arctic, when you look at Alaska from a kind of operational perspective, particularly with the Department of Defense, you see we exist at kind of what they call in the military the seams, operational seams. If you look at the different American combatant commands that are set up around the world, Alaska and the Arctic kind of are in the area where there's a lot going on, but in some ways, because there's so much happening, you don't necessarily have responsibility. Where the NORTHCOM commander is kind of the territory of Alaska and the Arctic. The PACOM commander, though, Admiral Harris on Hawaii, actually has operational control over the forces in Alaska. The EUCOM commander, the NATO commander, has a lot of interest in what's going on, particularly with regard to Russia and other actors in the EUCOM AOR. And then we have Strategic Command that are very focused on issues like missile defense in the U.S., which is all based in Alaska, mostly all based in Alaska and the Arctic. So in many ways what that does is it leaves it all up to the Coast Guard. And so their presence in Alaska and the Arctic is absolutely essential. The Admiral and I have had a number of discussions about trying to increase the Coast Guard's presence in Alaska, but to do it in ways that I think would have a positive impact on many of the different topics we're discussing here. So I'll just end it by saying, You know, one of the things that we tried to do on the Armed Services Committee recently was say, hey, this is a really important area of the world. It's really important for the United States. It does exist, particularly in the military space, at these operational seams. So it's almost as if it's really important, but no one's in charge. So we mandated in the Defense Authorization Act a couple years ago that the Secretary of Defense lay out a integrated strategy for the Arctic. And it was issued at the end of the Obama administration, the beginning of the Trump administration. And it focuses on a lot of the issues we're talking about here: Arctic Council collaboration, strengthening alliances and partnerships, partnering with other departments, especially the Coast Guard, search and rescue cooperation being enhanced, and from the military's perspective, more presence defending American sovereignty, looking at the capability of conducting freedom of navigation operations in the region, which I think are going to be increasingly important given what's happening in the Arctic. So I would just end by saying there's a lot of attention, but in many ways I still think we're behind as a nation to recognize that we're an Arctic nation. We're actually an Arctic nation because of Alaska. But with some of the leaders in the audience here, Alice Rogoff in particular has done a great job of highlighting a lot of this, and having the presence, and hopefully an increased presence, of the fine men and women who are in the Coast Guard, I think is one of the most important things we can be doing to advance U.S. interests in the Arctic.
Thank you, Senator. Admiral, the Senator gave me a perfect segue to ask you a question that sort of came up during the interview. So if you don't mind, I'd like to ask you this question, and that is, it seems like, as the Senator pointed out, a lot relies on the Coast Guard's capabilities and ability to respond in the North American Arctic, but also you are part of the Arctic Coast Guard Forum, so you have friends and allies that you work with to deal with search and rescue issues, other issues related to the Arctic. But in terms of the Alaskan Arctic, the North American Arctic, what are those things that you need to be better prepared and to actually execute your mission, because you have, as the Senator noted, so much to consider and react to, and hopefully think about ways to prevent?
Yeah, thanks, Mike. So if you go back 140 years, it was called Seward's Folly, and the entire territory of Alaska was acquired at the price of 2 cents an acre. Now, if you can imagine, at the height of the Cold War, if Russia had a base in Anchorage. So we're at another crossroad, and we do a very poor job of thinking strategically into the future, recognizing that the pace of change is much quicker now as we look at whether it's climate change, but just living in a much more connected world. But dating back to 1867, the Coast Guard had a presence in Alaska. And so this isn't new to us. What is new is that we just have not seen the investment. So when you start looking at what investments do you make in the Arctic, what does infrastructure mean in the Arctic? And so I took a lesson from Shell Oil Company, because what they were building were fleets of ships because they were a little bit trepidatious about investing on shore infrastructure, not knowing what's going to happen to permafrost in the next 15, 20 years. When the Coast Guard builds a base, we build it for 100 years, if not longer. And so when you look at what does it mean to exert sovereignty in the Arctic, you really need to do it from sea. You really cannot do it from shore unless it's a shore-based aviation squadron. But the next piece is we can't do it alone. And that's where partnerships come in. And so if you look at, what are the strategic tools at play? You have diplomatic, you have information, military, and economy. And we heard from the Senator about the various military approaches to the Arctic. But what can we do in the near term diplomatically? How do we prevent the Arctic from becoming the next 9-dash line, where Harry Harris is doing freedom of navigation maneuvers right now to stake a claim? We recognize we've got a Northwest Passage and a Northern Sea Route that both Russia and Canada claim as sovereign. Are there other approaches of how do we facilitate commerce? And maybe it's done bilaterally, nation by nation, if they are responsible stewards, if they abide by the Polar Code.
So I think we need to refresh of how do we diplomatically approach the Arctic in terms of what are the near-term challenges in the Arctic. And if you've never been up there, the first one is the environment. And many people think that it's ice-free. Well, ice-free is relative, and it's all depending on the relative wind. And it may shut in on you on a moment's notice. And so there's a lot of unknown. I think it's not widely known, the pace of change that is happening, but certainly if you follow the retreat of sea ice extent, and every year we seem to have a new record being set. I don't get at the causality of this, but we do know sea ice is retreating. As it retreats, that ocean absorbs more heat, and then the next year there's less ice in the following year. Huge impact on the indigenous tribes. If we are not engaged with the indigenous residents up in the high latitudes, we're missing the boat, right from the, we cannot do policy if we don't listen with both ears. So we have an aggressive outreach with the indigenous residents up there, because sometimes Washington doesn't always have the best ideas. And so it's important for us to listen there as well. But going forward, this is a region where we, the United States, and it just happens to fall on my shoulders as being the responsible service for the Arctic, to make an investment in this domain.
Thank you. Paul, I'd like to, again, key off what the Senator said about some governance policy structure issues and get your feedback on the thought of some kind of coordinated Arctic integrated leadership in our federal government. We have different leadership for different departments, different parts of our federal government. Would it be helpful to have a more integrated approach to Arctic leadership in the different components of the federal government?
I'm probably the wrong person to answer about the federal government in the United States, but in terms of the Arctic, cooperation, coordination, consistency among all of the Arctic states is necessary to implement the agreements that have been adopted by the Arctic nations themselves. So we have a search and rescue agreement, we have a pollution preparedness and response agreement. They are effectively hollow agreements in the absence of the infrastructure to implement them. I would suggest that the definition of infrastructure actually be broadened to include a combination of governance mechanisms plus built mechanisms. So the built would include ports and ships, mobile and fixed assets would include communication systems, research systems, observing systems, all of which require technical as well as capitalization to implement. But in order to be effective, the United States and the other Arctic nations need to be thinking in terms of cooperation, coordination, and consistency among the various measures that they adopt.
Thank you. Before I come back to Chief, Senator, maybe I'll give you a chance to respond to that. How could we move this forward in terms of having Arctic leadership in the different federal agencies?
Well, I think one thing that's very positive is the increasing interest in the Congress on Arctic issues that extends beyond the congressional delegation from Alaska. And it's increasingly bipartisan, and it's in the House and the Senate. And I've seen it in a whole host of areas, again, kind of related to armed services, both in the House and the Senate, but beyond that. And there's a real interest, for example, in the need for icebreakers with regard to the United States. And again, it extends beyond Senator Murkowski and myself and Congressman Young. So I think having the Congress, and in some ways the Congress has driven this. I think the State Department has been interested, certainly during our chairmanship of the Arctic Council. But I think from the perspective of the executive branch agencies, it needs to be much more integrated and much more broadly viewed in terms of infrastructure, telecoms, transportation, military issues. And we haven't done that yet. And a lot of the interest is being driven by the Congress, but we're hoping that the executive branch agencies can start to recognize how strategically important this region of the world is for America and the opportunities that exist, because I think there are enormous opportunities in the Arctic, and I know a lot of people in the audience do as well. So it's got to be Congress, and that's happening. It's going to continue to increase, I believe, but we really need to kind of make more of an impact from our executive agency perspectives, and, you know, of course, the Congress can influence that. That's how we got the Secretary of Defense to write an Arctic strategy, because the Congress of the United States told him to do it, so he did it. So sometimes that's what you have to do to move these things.
Thank you. I wonder, as the Chief of Operations in Iceland, I wonder, very simple question, but a very tough answer. What keeps you up at night? What do you worry about in terms of your capabilities in the North, knowing that there is more transportation, more shipping, more tourism, more demands on all Arctic 8 nations? So what is it that you worry about from your particular vantage point in Iceland, but perhaps from your colleagues in the other Coast Guards as well?
Well, I would say the next phone call from the operations center saying that in the middle of the night, waking me up, and my wife was threatening to divorce me because she's very tired of of these phone calls. But anyway,
these are practical answers to practical questions.
But well, anything major, you know, such as airliner going in the water in our search and rescue region, or fire, or cruise liner hitting a iceberg or something like that. This is going to be a major event for a small organization like ours. It's not only the operation itself, it's going to be all the media attention, it's going to be all the relatives and of people, and all the nightmare that will follow. This is what I would say keeps me up at night, but it's very interesting to know that we have our neighbors there to assist us and support if needed. That's very important for us.
Perhaps I can, thank you very much. Perhaps I can ask the admirals the same question, and you don't have to start your answer with the same opening.
Well, it's actually my job to keep others awake at night so that I can sleep. But by doing that, I challenge them strategically. You know, I mean, to be thinking about beyond the tyranny of the present. As we think about that, and this is, you know, I would say, first of all, whole of Coast Guard, whole of the Department of Homeland Security, we recognize we have a huge hole in our capacity within the United States right now, and then how are we going to pay this bill? And so we've done tremendous outreach with the 114th, now with the 115th Congress, and we've got a down payment to build 1/3 of a heavy icebreaker. That will take us through 18. I can't talk about the 19 budget because we're still debating that as well and beyond. And so I put markers down with our Appropriations Committee of, you know, I need steady, reliable, repeatable funding. And so even though I spent years and years as an operator, I'm in marketing and sales now. And so what do I do if I'm given a budget that does not allow me to have industry sell us a platform? And we need to build 6 heavy icebreakers. We've done all of the legwork to do that. But we haven't come up with the means to deliver those 6. We need to deliver the first one just for the beginning. The good news is we've got 5 shipyards right now. We're looking at commercial off-the-shelf designs from Finland, from Canada, and elsewhere, because I need to put the first heavy icebreaker in the water in 2023. So to really answer that question, Mike, is this. We will send the Polar Star down to Antarctica again this year. She's nearly 40 years old, and last year she broke nearly 80 miles of ice over 15 feet thick. Now, if she's beset in that ice, we have nothing in our inventory in the United States, and quite honestly, nothing among our allies that can free that ship beset in ice. So that concerns me. It does keep me awake at night. But that commanding officer gets even less sleep than I do, because he's got to make that hour-by-hour decision if they have a mechanical casualty do we call off the mission and we turn around and get ourselves home safely? And I empower our people to do that. But we as a nation cannot sleep on the fact that we are a nation that has 2 icebreakers in our inventory, 1 heavy icebreaker in our inventory. And we don't have that network of who is going to be that Carpathia that came to the rescue of Titanic. We do not have that in the United States right now. So that concerns me deeply, and it also concerns me that we don't have a funding way ahead to build out this requirement.
Thank you. We have about 15 minutes left, and I think what I'd like to do is open it up to some questions. So let's take some questions from the audience and use our time with this distinguished panel in that way. Perhaps we'll start on my left.
Hi, my name is Megan Alvana-Stimple with Arctic Geopolitical Consulting in Nome, and I'm honored to be here among so many experts. I have a question broadly to the panel. I don't know if many of you may recall the Alaska Territorial Guard, in that a lot of our young men in our communities are the first responders in the last frontier, as the slogan of the PSO program. However, what are the thoughts, your thoughts as our nation creates an Arctic strategy about reinvigorating the Alaska Territorial Guard to ensure that we have first responders present from Alaska to Greenland? Thanks.
Well, I'll take
I think I'm looking at the senator from Alaska.
Well, Megan, good to see you. I think it's a great idea, and I think that the governor has been focused on it, and General Hummel has been focused on it, and we're trying to be supportive on the federal side. We had a provision in the Defense Authorization Bill last year that enabled Guards members who travel far distances just to get to their training bases to waive, to have the Secretary of the Service that they're serving with be able to waive the kind of minimum payment they get for travel. You have a lot of people in Alaska who serve in the Guard and Reserves who actually end up paying the military to drill and to serve in the military because it costs so much just to get to the unit. So, well, I think it's a really important initiative. It's certainly going to take some time. You know, the Coast Guard is up in Kotzebue again this summer. They were last year, and they do a great job just recruiting our, you know, young men and women in terms of setting the example and getting people to want to serve. So it's a long-term endeavor, but I think it's a worthy one. And as you know, the tradition of service in the U.S. military for Alaska Natives is probably the most, it's a real special kind of patriotism that exists in Alaska because Alaska Natives serve at higher ranks in the U.S. military, higher rates than any other ethnic group in the country, year after year, generation after generation. So I think it's a match that we should all be continuing to focus on. It's a great idea.
Thank you. If I can just follow on to that. So we did a mass rescue exercise in Nome last summer, and we had Arctic Coast Guard Forum members participating or observing, to include Russia, were there as well. In the scenario, we're going to use 200 role players. This wasn't a tabletop, this was an actual exercise. So we're going to use 200 role players, and they've been exposed, they're hypothermic. We wanted to stress the system. And the mayor of Nome said, we don't need 200. 20 will more than stress the system. Of the logistics, of where is the nearest trauma center, then how do you get them there? How do you stabilize them there? So huge infrastructure challenges. So we're not going to fix that. So how do we prevent that from happening in the first place? How do we look at safe transit through the Bering Strait? Through a port and waterways piece of legislation that we're working through IMO on right now. So we don't have a collision at sea. I vividly remember, because I was on watch, when the Selendang AU broke apart. And that wasn't even, you know, that was through Unimak Pass, but on the Great Circle Route, and the challenges that posed, and then the environmental fallout when that ship broke apart. There was really not a whole lot that we can do about that because the tyranny of territory. But the more we can do on the preventive side, so we don't have to do the response, because the response challenges in this region are absolutely enormous.
Thank you. To my right.
Hi, thank you all for this really engaging panel. My question is in particular to Senator Sullivan. Really appreciate your leadership on this issue and pointing out the congressional component of this, that Congress is maybe a large voice in how we focus on the Arctic. I've had the ability to work on both the federal side and the congressional side, so appreciate both levers. My question is, we've talked a lot about Arctic cooperation and the rules of engagement, and one notable absence of this is the U.S. inability to sign on to the Law of the Sea Treaty. So curious as to whether you think the 115th Congress can actually ratify it this year or in the next couple of years, and if not, are you worried about us losing our seat at the table?
Well, I'm not sure that's going to happen this year. There's, for example, I had one big issue I had with regard to the treaty relates to the UN's ability to assess kind of fees with regard to American companies on mining and other operations like that. What's not unusual, though, if you look at the history of the Senate, is to look at treaties, to evaluate them, and to send them back saying, hey, if you change this provision or that provision, we'll then ratify it. And that's happened, I think, well over 100 times in the history of the Senate. It's a little difficult because other countries then have to change the treaty as well. But what we continue to do as a nation is abide by the customary international law that is set forth in the Law of the Sea Treaty, particularly as it relates to freedom of navigation operations and other areas. So I think it's an important issue. I know that our uniformed military officers often advocate for it, and there's a lot we can continue to be doing with regard to abiding by the international law that underlies the law of the sea, the customary international law components of it. I think, and I'm just one senator on this issue, there are elements of it that I have concerns about, and if those were addressed, I certainly think it would be a worthwhile exercise to look at trying to move forward.
Thank you. Paul?
Just as a comment on the Convention on the Law of the Sea, even though the United States hasn't, an important feature of customary international law in the Arctic is that it is being used, and it crosses different types of jurisdictions. So there are jurisdictions within the boundaries of nations, the sea floor, continental shelf, overlying exclusive economic zone, but beyond the exclusive economic zone is the high seas. And the high seas under the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea is a region beyond sovereign jurisdictions. And so in a sense, the Law of the Sea, whether the United States has ratified it or not, provides a framework where it balances national interests and common interests. There's an opportunity for nations to think in terms of national interests as well as beyond national interests in areas of sovereign jurisdiction. And whatever solutions come out of the Arctic in terms of the ocean, it will establish precedents for how we balance national interests and common interests on a planetary scale.
Thank you. My left.
Thank you. My name is Laurie Krieger, and considering the question I'm going to ask, I won't say what organization I'm from, I'll just say I'm here as an independent scholar. NSF, since December of 2016, has deleted virtually every grant that it's been offering on grants.gov. So my question is for the senator, are there any plans to delete NSF? And if so, which other agency would fund Arctic research?
Are you talking about the National Science Foundation?
I am.
So I think, we can get back to it. I think in the last kind of 6-month budget, I know that I and a lot of other senators, very bipartisan, were very focused on fully funding some of the important research that comes out of the National Science Foundation. We can get you the numbers on what the budget was for that, but I think it was, and again, I can get back to that, I think it was fairly robust, so I don't see any interest in the Congress to look. I actually think to get rid of NSF, I actually think one of the areas that's not reported in the media, a lot of the times I think when there's cooperation among bipartisan cooperation in the Congress, it doesn't always make the headlines because the attraction, I think, there's a lot more attraction to conflict and the, you know, fights than the bipartisan cooperation. But one area of bipartisan cooperation I've seen in my 2.5 years in the Congress is the federal government's focus on basic research, which is something I think that the federal government is, it's like infrastructure and other things that were very much a responsibility that, you know, we can do very well. So there's been, I think, strong NSF, NIH. We passed a bipartisan bill in December called the 21st Century Cures Bill, which was serious dollars going to cancer and Alzheimer's research in the billions. So it's an area where I think I've seen actually a lot of cooperation. And, but we can get you those NSF numbers that came out of last 6-month budget that we voted on. I voted for it just about a month ago, but I think the numbers on basic research in those different areas of the federal government were quite strong.
Thank you.
Thank you. I'm going to take one very brief next question, and then also at the reception afterwards, if you have additional questions, please stop any of us out in the reception area.
Okay, I'll be quick.
Thank you.
My name is Bill Greer. I'm from the Institute for Defense Analyses in Alexandria. I have an operational question. It's not a acquisition or a strategy or policy. My question has to do with envisioning the nearer future as Russia builds up, as we begin to move more presence, either Coast Guard or DoD forces, into the Arctic, and also NATO, particularly Norway, does the same. There's a chance of miscalculation and misunderstanding. What sort of operational measures are in place now or should be in place to prevent an escalation of an accident even or a serious situation at sea in the Arctic area?
I'll go ahead and take that
Thank
question.
you.
Yeah, so in the East-South China Sea, Navy, PLA Navy, they have what's called the Code for On-Plan Encounters at Sea. And so we don't have anything similar to that, but at the same time, you don't have large fleets operating up in the Arctic either. And quite honestly, our Coast Guards operate quite collegially together. And I'll give you an example in the North Pacific. Next month, I will send a frigate to the Western Pacific. It'll have a Chinese shipwriter on it. We'll be working with the Russian Border Service. We will fly aircraft out of Japan. We'll be working with South Korea. And so if you think of it, you got the United States, just think of this triad between the United States, but then you've got China, Korea, and Japan, who probably won't work bilaterally together, but they'll work with the United States. It's a different paradigm if we look at the Arctic because we have some of these are NATO members, but quite honestly, when we look at what are the near-term threats, and it's a sinking at sea, I think as Agmerson alluded to, the near-term threats are probably more humanitarian and not military in nature that really speak to Coast Guard equities. So I don't see a near-term requirement because we don't have vessels shouldering one another off. Should they try to ply the Northern Sea Route or the Northwest Passage and do that as a freedom of navigation exercise. But I think those straits probably do need to be addressed at some point in time as what is the way ahead as we address those two waterways, especially from a commercial aspect, maybe less so from a military one.
Thank you. Would you please thank the panelists for this, I thought, excellent discussion.